Mortis Media.
All of this started about 7 years ago. I was going to college and renting my uncle's basement, and on weekends I would usually drive home to my mum's house, which was about 40 minutes away. The first night that something strange happened, I was at my mum's house on a Thursday night after I got off work. I got to her place around 10:15 and went to my old room and started watching Netflix with my headphones on. I didn't have it too loud because my sister, who was in high school at the time, still had her room light on and occasionally would knock and ask me a question on her homework. The night was rather uneventful, and I decided to call in tonight and text her to wish her good night. I didn't get a reply, which made sense considering it was already past midnight, and she had to get up early to go help her grandma with something. I fell asleep shortly after. It was a nice, deep sleep. Suddenly I woke up to the feeling of someone getting up out of my bed. In my tiredness, my first thought was that it was Jill needing to get up for something in the night. As I reached out to touch what I thought was her hand, to clarify Jill was my girlfriend at the time, it was at that moment that I realized this was not Jill. This was a lot taller than her, and when it turned around it was a figure dressed in all black. Every time I've seen this figure, no matter the amount of light, the only thing that would hit it would be enough light to slightly outline the clothing, which was an old-timey suit with a long overcoat. The head was the same, with only enough light to barely make out the features, aside from a very obvious smile and eyes which held a very slight greenish tint, as if pale green light was shining gently into the eyes. Now, at this point, as soon as it looked at me, an intense feeling of fear washed over me, and, no lie, I started to cry. I had seen a good deal of things and nothing compared to that feeling. I started scrambling for my phone to shine a light on it, and as soon as I got my screen lit up and shined it in the direction of the figure, it was gone. Instead of turning on a light after that, I kept tapping the screen to keep it bright until I fell back asleep. I wasn't asleep for long. I woke up again with that same intense feeling. I looked to where the figure had been the first time, and there it was again, just standing and smiling. I grabbed my phone again and shined a light at it, but it was gone once more. This happened a number of times before I took up my laptop, adjusted the settings to keep the screen on, and then popped it up to shine on the area I had seen the figure, and I fell asleep with no issues for the rest of the night. The next sighting was around 1 week later. I was watching Netflix, this time as usual, and I heard my sister get up and walk into the kitchen and then come back, and I heard the lights click, meaning that she was finally going to bed. The time was around 11:45. Just outside my old room, to the immediate right, was the door to the bathroom, which had a nightlight to see when you woke up in the middle of the night, and the walls aren't super heavy duty, so when someone closes a door, the wall can shake if they don't close it nicely. That'll come into place soon. The way my bed and dresser was situated, my door was to the right, and I was tucked into the corner of my wall and dresser, so I had a backrest. With my laptop on my lap watching a show, I noticed out of the corner of my eye my door slowly open. I look expecting to see my sister, but as soon as I turned to look, the door slammed, shaking the wall I was leaning on. About half a second went by before that intense feeling of terror and dread came back, and I look up to find this phantom standing there smiling at me. As soon as I recognized it, I turned my laptop around and it was gone. Not wanting to deal with it again, turned Netflix off and called it a night. Now this is where activity really picks up. My weekends end and it's Sunday night, and I'm heading back to my uncle's so I can drop off stuff and head to work. I get back from work and play some video games for a few hours before going to bed at about 1 to 1:30. I was in a light sleep, and at about 2:30 I woke up to the sound of whispering. The way I had the basement set up, I had my bed on the opposite end of the windows facing the street, and I had a couple of bookshelves at the foot of my bed behind the TV to kind of separate the rest of the room from my bed. On the opposite side of the bookshelves, there's a couch to the left that I can still see from my bed, and the door to go to the hallway to the garage and the stairs to go up. I wake up from the whispering and start listening harder, thinking my uncle was still awake upstairs and on the phone or something. That's when I saw a head pop up over the bookshelves and look at me. As soon as I saw it, it popped back down for a handful of seconds before coming back up. I recognized it as the Phantom and turned on the light over my bed, and it was gone. I turn on a movie on my TV and get comfortable enough to turn the light off, and eventually I drift back off to sleep. The movie ends and enough time passes that the TV and DVD player go to sleep mode. Again, I wake up to the sound of whispering, and I quickly look around to find the Phantom sitting on the arm of the couch, just staring and smiling. That intense feeling comes over me again, and for what felt like 10 to 15 minutes we just looked at each other, and eventually the Phantom got up and walked out the door to the hallway. I fell back asleep for the rest of the night with no issue. The very next night the same thing happened again, but the only new thing was the sound of the Phantom dragging something heavy across the floor, which to this day I cannot figure out what it was, unless it was moving the chairs and then moving them back. The events of those 2 nights became a commonplace thing for the next few months. By now, it was getting into late summer, and I was riding my motorcycle as much as I could until I had to park it due to the bad weather. I always had a spot on the end of my bookshelf for my keys and wallet. Every day, that is the spot they would end up, never anywhere else. I had Thursday off that day for some reason, so I was taking my time to prepare myself for the ride down to my mum's and then stop out at Jill's and see her and her parents for a bit. Earlier in the year, I had traded my old bike for a 2012 Ninja 650R, and I was excited to take it down. I go grab my key after putting my wallet in my jacket pocket, and I can't find it anywhere. I grabbed the spare and put it in my jacket just in case, and started checking my old pants. Nothing. I check under a pile of clean clothes I had yet to fold. Nothing. I check my car. Nothing. No nice regular keys anywhere. So I figure I'll look later, and I go down for the weekend and make note to everyone to please keep an eye out for it, because I can't find it. I go back to my uncle's not having found the key, and I kind of forget about it. Events with the Phantom go on as usual for about 3 weeks. I head back down to my mum's, and I make a stop on Friday out at Jill's because she was off school. I get there and I help her do a laundry that's needed to be done, and we reach the bottom of an old pile. And lo and behold, there's my key. I don't know how it could have got there. Things go on as usual, and fast forward about another 4 months, Jill is taking the semester off school and gets a job at a place near where I live, so she starts staying a few nights at my uncle's with me. One night she's off work and watching a movie sitting on my bed when she told me she had noticed a shadowy figure pacing by the windows on the opposite side of the room. Now at this point, I had yet to tell her about the Phantom because I didn't want to freak her out or think I'm crazy. A few weeks go by, and randomly in the middle of the night she wakes up saying she's sorry. I asked her what she was sorry for, and she replied by saying that she's sorry that she kicked me. Me being tired, I responded saying it was okay, and she had asked to trade sides of the bed because she seemed to be a bit scared of something. I fall asleep for about an hour before I roll and kick something at the foot of the bed fairly hard. I knew it wasn't her because there was absolutely no give to what I had kicked. I quickly turned the light on above my bed, and we both look at the spot we had kicked, and the comforter was compressed and slowly rising as if whatever was sitting there had just gotten up. We both look at each other and decide to leave the light on and turn on a movie for the night. Some time goes by, and from a local restaurant, my uncle got a Valentine's Day balloon that he then gave me, so I took it downstairs and let it go to the ceiling. A few nights go by, and it's just the usual phantom antics, and I was thankful it didn't wake Jill up at all. Then another night when I was at work, and Jill was still at my uncle's watching movies with the light off work. There was a video of this on my old phone that she sent me, but when I recently checked the SD card, it got corrupted, so I lost the video. She was sitting on the bed when all of a sudden the balloon started bobbing up and down, making circles. It then bobbed and drifted over to where the phantom usually sat on the arm of the couch, and circled there for a few minutes before moving to the foot of the bed where it had been sitting and started bobbing and circling for nearly 5 minutes before bobbing back to where the balloon started and not moving at all after that. I looked at the video on my break at work and called her to calm her down, and then when I got home I popped the balloon and threw it away. Again, the usual deal with the phantom's antics for a few weeks before Jill and I were watching a movie. She was sitting up eating fruits by the foot of the bed, and I was half laying against her holding her hands across her stomach. She has poor circulation, so her hands are always cold, and I didn't think much of it. Now, just a fun fact, she usually eats fruit with 2 hands. Out of nowhere I feel the hand with fingers interlaced grab my hand incredibly tight and jerk away. I look up in anger at her, but then I see her holding her fruit with both her hands. All she said was, "What?" with a very confused tone. I told her it wasn't nice to squeeze my hand and then jerk it away. After that she gave me a very confused look, just wiggled her hand, saying that they had been there the whole time and she wasn't holding my hand. Thoroughly creeped out by this, we turned on all the lights and a movie before eventually falling to sleep. As more time went by, Jill returned to school full time and went back to live at her parents' house. I was still at my uncle's, working on what would be my last semester at school. Usually, things with the phantom went by and nothing too more out of the ordinary happened. His visits were a nightly basis, and the new year came, and then it was April, and I decided to change schools and left my uncle's and moved into a portion of Jill's parents' house that we rented from them. It was at this point which my run-ins with the phantom started to slow down a little bit, and I wasn't seeing him as close as I had seen before. Out of where they lived, there's a lot of old native Indian burial mounds and some in crop fields that are no longer there, but that's a different story. Anyway, that winter my best friend was down at his parents' house for winter break, and his parents were having their house depraised, so he just wanted to stay out of the way, so we stayed at my mum's and hung out and played video games for 4 days. On the second night in, at last, before a long break of runnings with the phantom, I gave my best friend the guest room, and I took the floor of the living room in the basement. I used a ton of blankets and built a sort of nest, so it was nice and comfortable. The way I was positioned at the head, there was a love seat that acted as a partition in the basement from workout equipment and the living room. To my left was a regular couch. At my feet was the TV, and behind the wall behind the TV was the guest room. The door to the guest room was just of the TV, and to the right of that was a small L-shaped hallway that went to the same direction as walking into the door to a small bathroom. I woke up in the night at 1:08 after not having been asleep for long. I check the time, then look around and look towards the hall, where I see the phantom standing in the hall, peeking around the corner. We look at each other, and then the phantom slowly walks down the half further and disappears into the dark. I fall back asleep, only to wake up again, this time 3 minutes later. The phantom was squatting at the corner of my nest, just to the right of my feet. I whispered to him to please go away and leave me be. His smile got wider. He stood up and walked back to the dark. Eventually, I fell back asleep and woke up again at 4:08. This time I'm lying on my back, and on all fours over the top of me is the phantom. His face 2 inches from mine, same slight green tint in his eyes, and a massive smile on his face. It felt like forever, but was really probably a minute, if that. Finally, he slowly got up and walked back to the hall, and before he disappeared, he turned back around and smiled again. And just like that, he was gone. At that point, he was gone for a few years. I thought there were maybe a few times where I saw him, but I was never 100% sure. Every time after that, when I had to go into my mum's basement, I would always get that same intense feeling, along with the feeling of being watched, but never saw him. Now we get to the part that was probably a bit dumb on my part. I was down in the basement for something, and I had this intense feeling before I finally said, "Alright, fine then, let's go." Just kind of asking it to follow me again, which kind of half worked at that point. On occasions I did start seeing the phantom once more, but always from far away. Since then, I'm no longer with Jill, and I now rent an old farmhouse just outside the town where I grew up. Fast forward about 2 weeks. I got on the subject of skinwalkers with my mum, and it reminded me of the phantom, and I was telling her about the stories too, just because it had been a while. I kind of thought it was odd that even though I had told the phantom to come along, that it never got too close, and I ended up telling my mum that. Even she had told me every now and then she would have an odd feeling when she was in the basement alone, late at night mostly. This kind of creeped me out, but I didn't think too much of it and eventually went home and relaxed, watched The Office with my dad. I moved him out there to keep an eye on him, being he has early onset Alzheimer's. No incidents that night at all. Now, this past Thursday, it was about 10:30. Things in the house were nice and quiet, and I was playing some Minecraft with my current girlfriend, using the phone to talk because that seems to work better for some reason. I had the volume off, just enjoying the quiet, and neither of us were chatting when I heard a man's voice outside yell, "Hey." It sounded like he was trying to get someone's attention. I at first thought it could be my landlord coming over to check on the house and close up the barn for the night, but I remember he came over in his buggy a few hours earlier, and it was far too late for him to show up. Thinking someone's out there messing with the horses, I grabbed my super bright light and one of my carry pistols and put on my shoes to walk out. I'm enough out of town that the only close house is my landlord's, and then no one else for quite a ways. I flip on the light to the entry and walk out. As soon as I got outside, I noticed that everything is pitch black. All of a sudden, I get an intense feeling of dread. I shine my light all over looking for something. As I was around my truck, I head towards the barn and the horse pasture, where I heard the voice coming from. At this point, I have my trusty EDC out. I'm ready to rock and roll. I shine in the horse pasture, which is fairly flat, and I don't see anything. I don't even see the horse, which means she was probably in the barn or out in the lower pasture. I shine my light into some bushes and a tree between the house and fence. That's where I saw a shadowy figure nonchalantly walk from a bush to behind a tree. With that, I kept the light there for another moment before getting that intense feeling of dread wash over me again. So I head back to check on my dad, and inside all is well. I quickly lock the doors, draw closed all the blinds, and text my friend who lives in town that I may have someone outside my house. By this point in my life, I've seen enough normal things and never been so scared to the point where I don't even make a sound and just turn and rush back inside the house. My friend says to let me know if I want him to come out and drive by and shine a light around the road and see if anything pops up, and then walk around and look so I'm not alone out there in case it is something. I told him I locked the doors and closed the blinds, to which we agree that's probably good enough for now. I stay up for about another hour or so before deciding to return to bed. As I sat there calming down, I was trying to think of who could have yelled. I thought maybe the landlord walked over and didn't turn on any lights to disturb me, and he was further in the barn, where I couldn't see, and maybe he was trying to get one of the horses' attention. As soon as I start to think that it was probably the answer, I got that exact same feeling from when I saw the phantom, and I knew it was him again. I finally get up and go to bed. There's a window in my room that faces right to the tree where I saw the phantom walk to. Not wanting to be convinced it was him, even still, I got a surge of adrenaline and quickly rushed over and closed the blinds and situated it better so anyone outside couldn't see in. My whole body was on high alert till about 3 a.m. when I finally fell asleep. I woke up around 10:30 just straight exhausted and took it easy. I had my usual day off and relaxed. Now that Friday night it wasn't too late in the evening, but I got home from working out with my best friend and took a shower and got cleaned up before heading to my girlfriend's. In my bathroom there's a clock that's been dead since I moved in. I'm not sure why, I just never put batteries in it, and I just kept forgetting to do so. The clock had always read 9:07, because growing up whenever I took a shower, I would always check the time, and instinctively I would always check the clock even though it always read 9:07. Well, that night it was different. I got out the shower and the clock said 12 exactly. That brings me to just now. I was trying to think of how far this goes back when I was telling my girlfriend about it, and it reminded me of a recurring dream I always had when I was 8. Whenever I would stay at my dad's apartment he had at the time, I would wake up and under my desk I would always see a face staring at me and smiling. So the first possible sighting would have been 17 years ago, but of that part I'm not sure, as it was so long ago. If anyone has any idea what this phantom could be, please comment and share. Over the years I've talked to my great aunt, who's very in tune with the spirits, and everything I've told her, she says that it could be a very bad and very powerful entity, possibly demonic. She said the key factors are the eyes, that it's tangible, and that it appears to more than just me, and the feeling it gave, to which I noticed. In high school, I had the basement bedroom all to myself. We lived in a 2-story home that was no more than 40 years old, but it always felt older to me because my grandparents had lived there before my family moved in. The first year in the house was my first year of high school, and I loved having a room all to myself. I had been sharing a room with one or more siblings my whole life up until now. There were 4 doors in my room, one that led to a bathroom, one that led to one of the main rooms of the basement, one for a small walk-in closet, and one that led to a small unfinished storage room with a drain in the middle of it. The sprinkler system controls were located in the small storage room, which I always thought was a weird place for them, given that it was the furthest point in the whole house from being near the outside. I should also mention that our basement had those small windows that are located near the ceiling, and are just big enough for a person to crawl through if need be. Although, other than letting a bit of light in, they were useless, as they had been painted when the house was built, and were basically sealed shut from the paint. On the outside, the windows were 2 to 3 feet below ground level, in wells that were covered in plastic domes. That first year of high school was quite an experience for me. I was homeschooled through 7th grade, and then moved after my 8th grade year. So I was in a new place, and social anxiety had always been a bit of a problem for me, and still is. But at that point in my life, I chalked it up to all the fear and weirdness I felt to just being a weird kid. I also suffered from depression all throughout high school, and to make an attempt at battling that, I tried to keep myself involved in as many things as possible. I did everything from sports to clubs to plays/musicals, and at the peak of certain seasons, I would have days where I would leave for wrestling practice at 4:30 a.m. and not get home until 10:30 p.m. or later after musical practice got out. Needless to say, I was exhausted a lot of the time, or at least tired enough that I should have slept like a baby. That's why it was weird when I started waking up in the middle of the night on a regular basis. It started out as just being an occasional thing, and sometimes it was obvious reasons, like having a bad dream, or if someone used the main floor bathroom, which was really loud with the pipes being just above my head. Then, about a month before the end of the school year, there was a night where I awoke, terrified for no reason, and it took me a while to calm myself down before I eventually got back to sleep. When I woke up next morning, I tried to recount the experience, and I figured that it must have just been a bad dream that I couldn't remember. The rest of the week was perfectly fine, but that weekend, I experienced the same thing. Waking up panicked, breathing heavy, and sweating. And this time I knew for sure that I had not been dreaming. I looked at my alarm clock, 3:23 a.m. Again, it took some time to calm down and get back to sleep. For quite some time I just laid there staring at the wall, wondering what had happened to me. Another week went by, and I continued to wake up every few nights, sometimes with the same overwhelming feeling of dread, sometimes slowly, almost so slow that I started to question whether I had been asleep in the first place. The weirdest, and what was starting to become the most concerning part of it for me, as I have a religious background, was that I would look at my clock every time I woke up frightened, and literally every single time, it would be 3:23 a.m. School ended, and I continued having these episodes, to the point where I would wake up a few nights a week, and being the weird kid that I was, I didn't think to tell my parents. It became a normal thing for me, so I learned to deal with it when it happened. It didn't seem so bad until I had a face to put with the fear. At this point, it was early into my second year of high school. The fact that I was waking up so much at nighttime wasn't seemingly having much effect on me at school. My grades were fine, and I still had plenty of energy to keep up with all the activities I was involved in. One way I found more consistent sleep was staying at friends' houses. I had a good amount of close friends, and I would spend a lot of nights at their houses, because I found I wouldn't wake up randomly at night when I wasn't in my own room. There was one night in December of that year that I was planning on staying at my best friend's house. We had been hanging out at my house for the afternoon, but we were planning on heading over to his place later to do our typical stay up late, play video games, and drink way too much Mountain Dew, as it was finally the weekend. What I didn't plan on was my dad getting super pissed off about some stupid thing and taking his anger out on me, in the form of driving my best friend home and not letting us hang out anymore that night. I went with my dad and my best friend, sitting in the back of the car sulking and building up my own anger at my dad at the unfairness of the situation. We were on the highway, about halfway to my friend's house, when I had this incredible urge to just open the door and jump out of the car. This really freaked me out, because I had never had that urge to do something like that before, even with my depression. Startled, I looked to the front of the car and away from the window, and immediately regretted it. Besides my dad and my friend, sitting in the front of the SUV, I was the only other person in the car. But when I looked up, I saw myself in the rearview mirror, and behind me there was another face, clouded in shadow, just inches from mine. I whipped around and almost yelled out, but there was nothing there. I didn't want to say anything to my dad given the current situation. I spent the rest of the drive constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see whatever the hell that was again. When we got back to our house, I pretty much just went straight to bed, just wanting the day to be over, but it was far from it. 3:23 a.m. There it was again, the time I had become too used to seeing. I tried to breathe, deeply. I tried to tell myself it's just some weird thing happening with your body, and you'll grow out of it. I turned over and began the process of falling back to sleep. But that's when I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet for my house. Eerily quiet, especially with the lack of outside noise, because of the time of year and the snow on the ground. I lay there on my side, staring at the wall with my back to the rest of the room, straining to hear anything in the silence. The only sound I could make out was the soft thump of my own heartbeat, which for some reason was getting faster and heavier. The dread was returning, the sick twist in my gut that I had become accustomed to this time of night, but had always been able to fight off before. I continued trying to control my breathing and tell myself that my growing fear was irrational, but the feeling was increasing, welling up in my chest and taking over any other feelings of comfort that I managed to establish. That's when I heard another noise. The sound of my pulse dropped out as I strained again to catch what else I was sensing. Unmistakable horror reached my ears and my chest at the same time. Footsteps, slow and soft on my carpeted floor, and approaching my bed. I have never understood the phrase frozen in fear until that moment. I wanted so badly to turn and face whatever this thing was that had been torturing me, but my body would not move. I continued to listen to the footsteps getting closer and closer, and I did the only thing I could, squeezing my eyes shut and muttering a prayer, convinced that the supernatural help was the only thing that could save me at this point. I stopped the prayer, realizing suddenly that all was silent again. The footsteps were gone, and I felt control of my body returning. I still lay on my side, listening for any sound of the sinister presence that I still felt nearby. After a few long moments, I finally rolled over to see an empty room, illuminated only by the light of the small window across from my bed. There was still something wrong though. There was a strange shadow in the light. I looked up to the window, and the horror returned. Just outside the window was the face from earlier that night, sitting there staring down at me. Even though the lights from behind it should have made it impossible to see, I could make out the eyes, dark and empty. and the most skin-crawling smile I have ever seen. Again, I was frozen with fear. I managed to pull my covers up, till all that was showing were my eyes, and the face and I stared at each other. I don't remember what thoughts were going through my head at that point, just the feeling of absolute terror of what I was seeing. At some point in this staring contest from hell, I blinked, and it was gone. I stayed up staring at the window the rest of the night, until I finally passed out from exhaustion. Upon waking up the next morning, I went and checked the window. There were no tracks, or snow, or anything. It appeared as though the plastic dome had been removed. The events of that night did finally give me the push to talk to my parents about it, and they assured me I was probably having nightmares, and getting in my own head about it all, and if anyone was trying to break in, the security system or the dog would make sure that we all knew it was happening. I still don't know what it was, but I'm convinced it wasn't just something in my head. Since high school, I still wake up at night inexplicably, although these days I don't even bother to check the time anymore. But I feel like I know what time it would be if I did. 3:23 a.m. Before I share my mum's experience, I feel like a little bit of background is necessary for you to understand, as my family's history is important. We are from a small town in Arizona. I was born there, but I've lived in the city since I was 5. My parents were born and raised there, as were their parents. The town has a slew of paranormal activity, maybe having something to do with it being known as an outpost of some sort for Spanish soldiers during the war. I honestly don't know which one, but it was several hundred years ago. There are rumors of witchcraft and many witches living there even to this day. It has a cemetery on a hill that is so old it has been condemned. You can literally fall through the ground and through an old coffin if you venture there, and the graves are so old that all the remains are piles of rocks. There are no markers of any kind, except for a few splintered, rotted wooden crosses. The house that my great-grandparents lived in was built somewhere in the mid-1800s. My mum grew up in the house, right next door. Many relics from the war have been discovered in this town, and when my mum was a preteen, she says her neighbors who were extremely poor, as they had dirt floors and always wore tattered clothing, discovered a chest of Spanish coins, both gold and silver, while digging a new septic tank. They became very wealthy overnight and moved away, but according to my mum, the family is still very well off. My family had somewhat of a dark history on my mum's side, and after her grandparents both died, her mum was cleaning out their house and discovered 2 voodoo doll type things that they believed were responsible for her parents, my mum's great-grandparents' death. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of background info. My mum has also always been ultra-sensitive. Her intuition is almost always spot on, and she has spent her life hearing and seeing apparitions and spirits from a young age, and also has dreamt of all sorts. Some of them about people who have already passed, some predicting deaths and other significant events in her life. She passed on some of these traits to me, and she says I am also sensitive based on some of my dreams and experiences. She's told me several times of a dream she has while spending the night at her grandparents' home. She said that there was nothing significant about that day or night that she can remember. She was about 13 years old at the time. She went to bed around 9, which was normal, after helping cleaning up the kitchen, where she stayed and slept in the guest bedroom. And since all her aunts moved away and had their own families, she was alone in the room. The dream started as if she had just woken up in a strange place. She said that immediately a pungent, musty smell hit her nostrils, and it was so dark she could hardly see her hand in front of her. When she lifted her hand to look at it, she heard the sound of a chain rattle and felt something cold and heavy on both wrists. After feeling them, she realized they were thick shackles, and they were attached to the wall behind her, so her movement was limited. She started to feel the rest of her body, and she said she didn't feel like herself. She was extremely thin. She could feel her ribs sticking out, and she wasn't wearing any clothes. Her hair was cut very short and uneven from what she could feel, and her face felt very thin as well. Her cheekbones were also sticking out. She noticed that she could faintly hear the sound of men's voices and the sound of horses, but it was far from where she was. It smelt dank and faintly like horse manure, and the floor she was sitting on was dirt. The wall felt hard, like clay or some type of concrete. She started telling herself this, that she was just dreaming, but she couldn't escape how real it felt. The smell, the sounds, the weight of the shackles and chains. About the time she started to hear the other chains rattling nearby, as if there were others that were chained up as well. She could hear them whimper and cry, but no one near her used any words. At that point, a feeling of complete terror and dread hit her, like she knew she would never escape or be rescued and she would perish there. She started to look around, and she said she couldn't see anything besides or in front of her, but when she looked up, all she could see was a small window or opening about 2 feet by 2 feet, and it had 4 to 5 vertical bars on it. It must have been at least 50 feet up from the floor, so there was no way she could reach it or look out of it. She realized that's where the voices and the sounds of horses were coming from. She started to panic and pulled the chains, tugged at the shackles, but to no avail. Neither would budge. She was trapped, and there was no way out. At that point, she had told herself she had been dreaming and tried everything she could think of to wake herself up. She bit herself on the hand, pinched herself, and even slapped herself, but nothing would wake her up. After what felt like hours of this, she resorted to just bawl her head off and laid down crying herself to sleep. She woke up in the bed that she had fallen asleep in, which was at her grandparents' house. When she opened her eyes, her cheeks and pillows were wet with tears, and her heart was pounding in her chest. She said she felt that horrible panic and fear for several minutes, until she realized she was awake and in the room she fell asleep in. She immediately got up and went to her grandparents' room. It was early, but they were already awake. She proceeded to tell them everything about the dream in detail. Her grandpa, who she was very close to, hugged and comforted her, reassuring her that she had just had a nightmare, that everything was okay, and she just had a vivid imagination. When she went home later and told her mom, she told her the same thing, that it was her imagination. It took her a few days to get over it, but eventually she forgot about the dream and didn't think about it again until several years later. As I mentioned to you before, my great-grandparents' house that they lived and died in was really old. Growing up, it was always in need of some kind of repair. The roof and the walls were always being worked on. My mum said she was pregnant with me, so she was about 22 when the floor needed to be redone. And it was no easy job. The entire floor required to be torn out. By this time, both of her grandparents had already passed. Her parents lived in the house. My uncle and a couple of cousins were skilled carpenters, so they decided to do the job. My grandparents and my 2 uncles had to move out for about a week in order for the repairs to be completed. This is the part that freaks me out to this day. My grandma said the floor had never been redone up to that point, so she didn't know when the original floor was made. What they found has remained an open family secret for 40 years, but to this day no one speaks of it. When the floor was completely torn out, my uncle expected to find dirt underneath it. Instead, it looked like a boarded up cellar. It was empty, but there was an opening in the corner that resembled a shaft of some sort. The cellar floor was made of some type of old wood and was rotted, so they decided to tear it out as well. There wasn't dirt under that floor either, but another room. It was said that there were 4 floors underneath in total. all of them pretty much empty, besides some old saddles and horseshoes, and some old wine bottles and that sort of thing. But on the very last level, deep underground, there was a room with a dirt floor, with shackles on the walls, and some skeletons still bound by the shackles. There were actual bodies underneath the house. According to my mum, my uncles and cousins got pretty spooked, and they ended up covering everything. The bodies are still there. They didn't want to disturb them. They built a new floor, and no one talks about it anymore. When word reached my mum of what had been found, she immediately remembered her dream. She now knew that she had experienced something that really happened a long time ago. So I guess it wasn't really a dream, more like a glimpse of the past or some sort of time travel. She always cries when she talks about it. As for the house, it's still there and was occupied by my grandma till she passed away back in 2014. The property still belongs to the family, but the house has been condemned. The roof caved in a few years ago. All I know, if it ever leaves the family and is sold, someone is in for a real surprise should they decide to tear it down. So that's my mum's story. I hope you enjoyed. When I lived at home, my stepbrother and I stayed in the basement. It was made into more of an apartment by my stepdad. Bathroom, living room, kitchen, bedroom, and office. Oftentimes at night, I would see a girl looking to be between the ages of 7 or 8, running around near the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress and a red headband with long brown hair. I told no one about this, but then at a party I heard my stepbrother relaying that a little girl was running around the basement. He described her in the exact same way I did. I told my mum, and she thought we were crazy. I also started seeing a tall man in the basement. He liked to sit in a particular recliner. Around this time I started to get questioned if I was sneaking my stepdad beer, and I was not. I did not want Coors Light, or even like it at the time. Fast forward a few years, and this keeps going on. I have moved out and went to college. Other siblings were blamed for sneaking beer. My mum and her friends liked to get together and do off-the-wall things. They decided one time to pay for the angel ladies to come over to someone's house. The first person cancelled, the second person cancelled, so it fell onto my mum as the host. This is where it gets fun. They came into the house and said it was an instant hotspot. They said a very tall man in a navy uniform was standing there with a little girl in front of him. He had his hands on her shoulder. My grandmother was also alive at the time and was just there for the fun and wasn't going to get read. The angel ladies wanted to read her, so basically they did it for free. So they do the readings in the basement. When it's my grandmother's turn, my mum joined her. They said that the man and little girl are there. After some time, it is determined that the little girl, who they are calling her angel baby at this point, is my aunt who died at the age of 3 or 4 of leukemia. So up until now, things have been overly personal, other than the matching the descriptions of the thing I saw. They said that the angel baby said, "I saw the angels, mummy," and my grandmother went white. She said the last thing she said to her was, "Do you see the angels, sweetie?" And my aunt said, "No, mummy, there are no angels," and then she died in my grandmother's arms. She also started playing with her hair and pointing to the closet. They said she wants them to know something about her hair. My grandmother revealed that we had a lock of her hair in the closet that she was pointing to. The angel baby was also asking for her dolly, which my mother revealed was upstairs on a church pew in the family room. We had a family room and a living room. No one ever went into the family room. It was forbidden except for Christmas. The angel baby then left, and the focus switched to the tall man in the navy uniform. And this is where it gets less interesting, as I forget the details. I've not heard many dealings with my uncle in the basement. Right off the bat, this was identified as my uncle, who died when he flipped his Jeep. He wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and his head came out of the window and went between the vehicle and the pavement. Anyway, he eventually reveals that he likes to sit in the recliner and drink beer. This was told without any prodding about strange goings-on or anything else. He also pointed at my mother and made the motion with his hand like "you owe me." They said something traumatic happened to her daughter, and that he was there and saw her through it, as a few years earlier my sister flipped her car, really good flip too, onto the front bumper. To this my mum exclaimed, "I don't owe him shit, he's drinking my beer and living here for free." Beyond this, I can't remember what else came out with my uncle. Now for the only scary thing that happened. On the way out through the front door, you have to walk past the family room. As my mum was saying goodbye, she glanced over and noticed that the church pew was in disarray and the doll was slumped over. Surely someone could have messed with it, but they assured her that they were not in there. Plus, I believed they were the last readings, and no one else was involved or listening. The fact that my uncle was with my sister when she wrecked her car makes sense in a way. He was a godfather when he was alive. My sister was 3 or 4 when he died, and my mum said that he is now her guardian angel. She took that as a fairy godfather and thought it was great. It was my first time staying home alone while my whole family was out at my brother's ball game. I was 13. Anyway, I'm on the phone with a friend of mine feeling so grown up when someone beeps in on the other line. I tell her I'll be right back and click over lines. Then the creepiest voice I've ever heard says, "Hello, little girl. I'm the man in your basement." Honestly, I laughed it off and just hung up, thinking it was a prank call. I was a pretty confident little thing, and my neighborhood was pretty safe, so I figured someone was just messing with me, knowing it was my first time alone. They beeped in again, so I clicked over and heard, "Don't you hang up on me, you little," and the lights started flickering, and there was banging under my feet. I know it sounds crazy, but my dog started freaking out and my cat ran away, so I assume I wasn't imagining anything. Our basement was actually just an area connected to the garage. It wasn't finished. I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the garage steps to get into our kitchen, and I threw stuff in front of the door and heard yelling and whatnot. I kept trying to hang up and call the cops, but every time I tried to, he was still on the phone. My friend told her parents what was happening, and they ran to the neighbor's house to call the police for me. I sat petrified with a broken rifle, a butcher's knife and a baseball bat behind my front door, because it's the only place in the house downstairs that can't be seen from a window, crying. Eventually, I clicked over the phone to hear a police dispatcher on the phone and stayed on the line with her until the police arrived. There was no sign of forced entry, though we had a broken window pane on our outside garage door that had been messed up for months prior, and my guess is that he used that to get in. The police assumed I was just a paranoid girl, and they were going to leave me home alone after they gave me the all clear. Fortunately, a family friend had been driving by and saw the cops, and they all stopped to see if everything was okay. He gave me a ride to the school where my family was. They were skeptical that anything had happened, but we did get a security system not too long after that, and my parents both got cell phones too, as this was '94. After that happened, I swear there was someone stalking me for years. I would leave my apartment locked and bolted, and come back to find appliances, like my hairdryer or stove, maybe heat on, in the middle of summer. I lived in 4 different places, and would get strange phone calls at every one, despite being unlisted. Cars would randomly be parked down the road from the house, and speed up and slam on the brakes, and I would run inside. I'd hear bangs outside where I lived, even when I was out in the country. Nothing has happened since I've been in my current home, and I'm married, but I am paranoid all this time. I had a great-grandmother who had a house similar to ours. She was the sweetest thing ever, and even at the age of 108, beat me at rummy. She had an estate, situated on a small drop next to a wooded ravine. The house was very old-fashioned, with 3 wraparound balconies for each floor of the house, all connected with metal staircases. Honestly, probably the worst estate for an elderly woman to live in. We used to have Christmas at her house, and all the kids would go down to the basement to play pool or pachinko. As the years went on, eventually it was just me and my siblings in the basement each get together. I was the youngest, so I was the slowest. Whenever it was time to go upstairs, my siblings would race up the stairs and turn the lights off. Each time they did this, I felt a horrible, sinister presence rush towards me in my mad dash up the stairs in the dark. When she passed away, my cutthroat family descended on the estate like vultures. I was about 20 and despised the whole thing, but I went with my grandpa to see the damage of everyone's greed with him. It was really sad to walk around the house with him, seeing everything his kids and her husband's kid had taken. My great-grandfather was in fact my grandfather's step-grandfather. He was genuinely disappointed and hurt. I couldn't help but feel for him and share in his disappointment. When I saw the table that me and my great-grandmother played rummy at had been taken only a few months ago. Then we went down to the basement. The familiar surge of unpleasant energy was present, but not overwhelming. We looked around my great-grandfather's office and saw it was stripped clean, except for some filing cabinets. The only other thing was now the broken pachinko machine. Then we entered my great-grandfather's workshop, which I had no idea existed in the basement. Unlike the rest of the basement, this area didn't have giant windows and was only poorly lit by some track lights. Shelves of tools were everywhere. It was like a small warehouse. The feeling of dread washed over me, and I fought the urge to get out of there. Rusty circular saw blades mounted on the walls. Generally a very poor place for kids to hang out right next to. I never spoke of the basement with anyone, but it just didn't feel right. It felt like something was down there, suppressed, but angry, and violated. Maybe that's the reason my great-grandma was always super religious. She was the one who sent us to a Christian summer camp after all. Back in high school, I went homeless for a time and had to crash on my friend Kate's couch in the basement. It wasn't the most comfortable situation, but it was better than sleeping in my car, or so I thought. I awoke in the dead of night, and I had to pee. So I flung myself up from the bed and saw a 10-foot-tall, skinny shadow just looming over me. Keep in mind it was pitch black in this room, yet this thing was so dark, I could still make its form out. I felt this intense rot and dread, and I felt like it was looking right at me. I blinked, and then it disappeared. I called my other friend Andrew and asked to go stay over there, and noped the hell out. A few months later, I was back to living with my parents, and Kate invites me over to go sleep over and chill out. But I ask if it's okay to bring another friend, Ethan. So Ethan drags his dog along, and we all go into the basement where I saw this thing. Immediately, the dog starts going apeshit the moment he gets down there. He just begins running around and barking. Ethan was really confused as why his dog was acting like this, and goes, "I'm sorry guys, I don't know what got into him." But me and Kate knew. We knew exactly what was going on. So we told Ethan what was up, and that what I saw wasn't some fluke. So Ethan gets the idea that we should look for an object or something down there that maybe this entity could be tied to. After about 2 hours, we come up with nothing. We start to think maybe it's the house. Then Ethan spots something. A bunch of thumbtacks in the wall in a really weird pattern. So then Kate pipes in. "Hold up, maybe it's trying to tell us something." It's now 3 a.m. in the morning, and we're searching for dialects the thumbtacks could be. Eventually we find it was Morse code. So I ended up translating the Morse code, and it spat out coordinates. The location was only 40 minutes away. It was this volleyball field. After we found out what the thumbtacks were, his dog finally calmed down, and the dread that filled us lifted. We never found out what was there, but man, there was something seriously wrong in that basement, and we never went to check what was in the volleyball court. My family moved into a house about 2 years ago, and we found out one of the previous owners died in the dining room. No big deal. I sit at the table to eat. No one else in my family does. We know her name. L is what I'll use. Occasionally we'd make jokes like L moved something. My mom watches paranormal things and believe Elle has attached herself to me because I'm the only one who sits in the dining room. One day over a year ago, I had burning on my stomach after eating there and lifted up my t-shirt to find 3 scratch marks. I wasn't concerned because I'm not afraid of Elle, but my mum was freaked out. Fast forward to last week. I was in the basement to do laundry and heard a guy whistle a tune for 30 seconds straight. I froze and felt like someone was behind me. I didn't look, did laundry, and ran upstairs. I waited for my brother to check the basement. There was nothing, and I told my mum. The very next day I went back down to the basement, and when I come up, my mum says it wasn't funny as she thought I was whistling and that she had heard it through the vent. When she heard it, I wasn't in the basement, and it wasn't me. She said 10 seconds of a tune, and we checked the basement, but there was nothing. There's an owl statue down there that my dad got, but we don't know where from. It's very creepy, and was the only thing behind me that first night. My mum said we're getting rid of it. We carried it outside but accidentally dropped it, shattering it to pieces outside the house. She thinks she set the ghost free, and it went into her. Again, she watches a lot of paranormal shows. I said maybe she let it free. We haven't had any problems since, but we also haven't gone into the basement. She wants to burn sage, but I'm unsure. I also don't understand why this stuff happens out of the blue, and your thoughts would be appreciated. This occurred to my brother. My house was built in 1904. It's a single-family home, wood frame setting on a concrete block foundation. I have been living here for 18 years. All of the weird things that my siblings and me have seen or heard in this house, this one event is the most vivid. About 15 years ago, my brother and his best friends had started a garage band playing mostly Spanish rock, alternative music, but in Spanish. His friends could only get together on Sunday afternoons. They would practice in the evenings, and they would usually call it quits by 8 p.m. This was the time I usually showed up and went to bed, because I worked the graveyard shift. I usually slept for a few hours before heading to work. This event happened in the late fall, so the days were getting shorter, and they had just finished a long session when the decision to head to someone else's house came about. My brother handed his car keys to his buddy so they could load up the equipment everyone had filed out of the basement. The tricky part was that they needed to walk all the way to the back of the basement, up the back stairs, through the kitchen, down the hall into the living room, and out into the front door, where there was a porch. Everyone was outside sitting in my brother's truck waiting for him. My brother was walking up the back stairs when he remembered that he had left some food in a container sitting on a speaker in the basement. He made the decision to go back for it. Now the basement is not clean. With 4 sight lines, there had been partitions made, and the boiler and the main heating unit are right smack bang in the middle. So after my brother walks back, he's about to retrieve his food container, when out of the corner of his eye he sees it. It's a shadowy figure right at his peripheral vision. This feeling of dread and uneasiness washed over my brother. We had been taught that if you are in the presence of a spirit or ghost and you feel a bad vibe, to say a quick prayer, or to cuss at it. My brother chose the latter and said, "I don't have time for this." My brother turns around, not glancing into the dark corner. He starts to walk off to the back of the basement and briskly up the stairs, closing the door and turning off the lights as he leaves, with the last light switch on the opposite side of the front door. Luckily, the door was open, and the light from the street lamp was flooding the living room with its amber light. My brother said he felt someone at his back as he walked out the house, but at no point did he turn around as he flicked the last switch in the living room, and it went dark along with the rest of the house. As he stepped out, he pulled on the door, closing it behind him, still holding his food container in one hand, and jogged down the few porch steps and walks towards the front gate. Our house resides far from the main street, essentially having a large front yard but no rear garage. As he closed the gap between himself and his friend's truck, he kind of smiled and thought things over in his head, mad at himself for spooking out when there was no reason. He climbed into the driver's side of the truck, putting his seatbelt on and getting ready to pull out of the parking spot directly in front of the house, when one of his friends asks, "Hey, wait, what about your brother? Isn't he coming with us?" "What do you mean?" "He went to work early tonight. He's already gone. Did you see his car anywhere?" They all stared at him in disbelief and asked, "So then, who was walking behind you when you were leaving the house?" I don't live in the greatest area, nor in the nicest apartment, so I'm always kind of checking my surroundings when I'm out and about. Nothing crazy, but just being aware of what's going on around me. This being said, the other night I decided that the mountain of dirty clothes inhabiting my closet was bordering on disgusting, and it was time to do one of my least favorite chores, laundry. I don't mind doing laundry itself, but the laundry room in this building always gives me the creeps. It's in the dank and dark basement of the building, and you always have to grope the wall for the light switch. It would really make an excellent location for a horror film, to be honest. So I go down, throw my laundry in the machine, and everything is fine and dandy. I come back 40 minutes later to throw it in the dryer. Nothing out of the usual. Yet. An hour later, I go back down into the basement to collect my stuff out the dryer. Well, when I turn on the light, the dryer door is open, and my shit is all strewn about. On the ground, hanging out of the dryer, and to top it all off, they're still wet. Which was the worst part, because I didn't want to have to keep coming down to the laundry room because I'm a lazy shit. Normally I'd be like, whatever, because sometimes people open dryers and just don't close them. But this really looked like someone rummaged through my stuff. Shrugging this off, I put my stuff back in, and that's when I get a sharp chill running down my back. It was so random. I genuinely felt like I wasn't alone. So I turn around back to the elevator, and all of a sudden I hear the sound of someone frantically running up the stairs on the other side of the room, almost as if they had been spotted. I get all my laundry back to my apartment, and notice I'm missing some stuff. But at this point I'm kind of creeped out, so I'm not in the mood to go down snooping around for some t-shirts. So I kind of just forgot about it, until a couple of days later. I received an email from our landlord telling all the residents that a homeless guy not only broke into the building, he performed sexual acts on himself in the laundry room, and then started a fire and went around the building trying to break into people's unlocked apartments. So I'm guessing this guy went through my stuff, probably took something, did God knows what with it, and then started an actual fire. During my high school years, my friends and I had a thing for ghost hunting. We would always drive out into the country and explore old abandoned houses, just trying to scare ourselves. At the time, my mother worked for the Girl Scouts at the main office, and it was located in one of the oldest buildings in town, which was rumored to be an old children's home. My mum told me that many employees believed the building was haunted by a little girl. One of the employees had to go to the office late into the evening to finish some work and took a 4-year-old with her. She was sitting at her desk, which was located next to the main staircase, when she noticed her daughter standing at the bottom of the stairs. She asked her what she was doing, and she replied, "Can I play with her, Mummy?" The alarm had to be disabled by her mother when they arrived, so they know for sure that no one else was in the building at the time. This story gives me chills, as there's no reason for a toddler to lie about something like that. I remembered this story and asked my mum if she would let us in the office at midnight one night. We took our camera and started roaming the office. It's a very large, old 3-story building with many offices. Each footstep could easily be heard with loud creaks. After exploring the upper floors trying to spook ourselves, we decided to enter the basement. The entrance to the basement reminded me of a scene straight out of a scary movie, with graffiti and random sketches on the walls. It was a very small basement, with wooden joists supporting the floor above us. We found some old books covered in dust and started to read them. I had the camera in my hand, which provided the only light in the basement. After reading about 3 sentences, we heard footsteps directly above us, as if someone was walking down the 1st floor hallway. I whipped the camera up, and you could actually see the floorboards moving, as if someone was stepping on them while walking, and dust falling down. I instantly got the hell out of there, and pissed off my friend when I forgot I had the only light. We actually had it on film, and watched it over and over again that night. It was the freakiest thing that's ever happened to me. It was over 10 years ago, and I wish I knew where the film was. I experienced the 3 knocks on my bedroom door in the middle of the night, while hanging out with a friend and my brother. We lived in bedrooms in a half-finished basement, mostly concrete. It was 2 a.m., and we were just hanging out staying up late when we heard a knock on the door. 1, 2, 3. I said come in, but nothing. So I forgot and continued to socialize. When the knocking happened again, 1, 2, 3. This time we were like, who the hell is it? Got up, opened the door, to nothing. That's when we got freaked out. My mum was sleeping upstairs and could hear her snoring to high heaven. No one else was in the house except for us, and all the doors were locked. So we kind of start freaking out. We shut the door and just sit there. The knocking comes again. 1, 2, 3. But then this time it's accompanied with a doorknob turn. 1, 2, 3. My brother is a bit braver than me, so he approaches the door and peeks below. This is an unfinished basement, a crappy one at that, and the door has a clearance on the bottom of about 3 inches. So he peeks and he makes out a shadow. It's dark beyond my bedroom in the basement. The shadow seems to sit there, but not coming off or anything. And then he looks at the knocking and turning of the doorknob, and it starts again, over and over until we start screaming, yelling for our mother, my friend yelling her name, and the knocking and turning didn't subdue until she descended the stairs and opened the door. She yelled at us and told us to shut up. It never did happen again, and we never found out what it was. My ex-stepdad came to visit a few weeks later from Washington State and said he had a tall bearded man sometimes in his peripherals down in the basement. I looked up the 3 knocks, and it's called the death knock. No one's died of yet, and this was 14 years ago. I was a utility locator. I used to work on a team with my dad. To find a gas service from the gas main to the house, you must connect the equipment at a gas meter. Many older homes have the gas meter in the basement. Sometimes, I would be the one that would connect the equipment, while my dad found the gas service. In this particular day, we get to a house that had the meter in the basement. I go up, knock on the door, and the homeowner points me in the direction of the stairs to the basement. I go down, and I see the gas meter in the corner with 2 walls built around it, making it like a closet with no door. Behind the gas meter is the old crawl space halfway up the cinder block wall. There are no lights in the crawl space. I step into the closet area, and I hear what I can only describe as a demonic growl come from the crawl space. I step out, call my dad, and I don't want to sound spooked. I just say I need a flashlight. He hung up, I stood outside the doorway and just reached in and hooked up the equipment. My dad comes downstairs with the flashlight, and as he steps through the door to see if I got it in the dark, that same demonic growl comes from the crawl space. He about knocked me over trying to get me back. He hands me the flashlight and goes back outside. I just stood there pointing the flashlight into the crawl space, with a feeling that something was watching me. He calls and says he's done. I grabbed the equipment as quickly as possible and got the hell out of there. I don't know what it was, but I've never heard a growl like that before or since. During high school, my bedroom was in the basement. It was a finished basement, probably done in the 80s. My bed was near the bottom of the stairs. The floor was cheap linoleum on concrete. My parents were away for the weekend, so I had the house to myself. I was responsible, no big deal. They left me $40 for food. Anyway, I shoot out of bed after hearing a metal crash. It sounded like someone was coming down the stairs fast, tripped, and dropped whatever they were carrying. I'm sitting upright in the dark, trying not to move and listening for any sign of who it is. My first thought is, did someone break in upstairs and try to carry everything down and through the garage? 20 seconds go by, but it feels like an hour. I can't hear anything, so I get up and turn on the light. I am astounded by what is in front of me. I can't acknowledge it. It's in my head. It's not real until I say it out loud. I whisper, "Spoons?" Dozens of spoons, forks, knives. My brain can't process this at 3 a.m. I'm standing there swaying, staggering, dumbfounded that at my feet are utensils. It took me a good 5 minutes to finally figure out that a box of old silverware had somehow shifted in the storage above the stairs. It fell down and tumbled down the stairs, spilling its contents all the way down. Strangest sound in the middle of the night, and definitely the strangest thing I've ever had to wake up to. This happened to me a number of years ago. An altercation between my parents and I left me without a home. Don't worry, we're cool now. It was all my fault. Definitely shouldn't have brought those drugs into the house, but being a stupid 18-year-old with no money, I was desperate. However, being kicked out of the house put me towards the straight and narrow. I had to find a job, as at the time, I was just sitting at home playing Xbox for most of the day, to the point that my parents' frustration grew immensely. This is why this story happened in the first place. I needed to get a job, and a friend of mine worked at a local movie theater and told me that they always needed staff. Their turnover was something insane. So I got in touch, and within 3 days he was giving me an interview. I show up, and he smirks at me, and we both just laugh in the interview room. He asks me some generic, chilled out questions, and at the end says, "Yeah, Brian, you got the job." It was more the formality than anything. And by the end of the week, I have my uniform and my rota, and I'm going to be paid eventually. I actually moved in with him for a few weeks just to get off my feet, and we were having the best of times at the movie theater. There's not that much work to do, to be honest. It was a small town, and the movie theater was the only one in town. So it was popular during the weekends, but during the weekdays, there wouldn't be much going on, especially not during the day. Now this movie theater was old. Really, really old. I want to say about 1910 or something like that. Point being, we had this dark and eerie basement at the bottom that housed all sorts of old things. It was creepy, and it had those lights that take ages to turn on. I used to call them the stagger lights. We go down the stairs to the basement every once in a while to store old movie posters, cardboard cutouts and things like that might be helpful in future or that we may use as giveaways and prizes to keep sales in the theater and have people come back. We're good like that. Don't just throw them all away. In any case, our trips down to the basement were frequent enough to make me afraid of it. It was dark, a little bit damp, and smelled. It always had this strange sensation, like I was being watched in the dark. To explain, it was a very big, dark room, right underneath one of the main theaters, with huge supporting pillars. It looked like a car park nearly. It was that big. At the edge, there was a small booth with a glass window. I still have no idea what was supposed to be there. Was that security? In any case, we didn't actually have security. Point being, this was just a very creepy place. Lots of old things, old boxes, and stuff that people had for the most part forgotten. After a few months of working there, I had gotten into the routine. I was actually quite a good worker, and me and my friends got along excellently. and the theatre was doing great business-wise. It was on one of these days where I didn't have much to do that my boss comes up to me and asks if I'd like to do a bit of overtime. Me, being young and hungry for money, asked him exactly what this entails, and he leads me down the stairs to the basement when I get a pang in my stomach. Oh no. He tells me that he wants me to organize and dispose of whatever we don't need here, that I need to make a list of everything we have, organize it so that he can go through the list and let me know what is to be kept and what is not. And once that's done, for us to then organize what's left. He said he wasn't sure how long this whole thing would take, but that he would like me to stay overtime or before my shift started, whichever was convenient for me, and try and do as many hours as it took to sort this out. The pay for doing this task was quite good, and the fact that he hadn't told me how many hours it would take meant that I could go as fast or as slow as I wanted to, which is nice because it was such a chilled environment. So I started early one Friday afternoon, got into the theatre around 8, and being the only person in there, went down to the basement. I started looking through the boxes, loads of old random stuff, magazines from the town that we were featured in, old posters, old merchandise, loads of things. I even found a really old projector, and I wondered if I could take it home if no one wanted it, or if it still worked. As I was going through the stuff, minding my own business, do I hear something from behind me? It was coming towards that funky little booth in the corner that I still didn't know what it was. I wondered if it could be a rat. I hate rodents of any kind, and didn't have anything to protect myself, so I grabbed the nearby broom and started quietly making my way over, seeing if I heard the noise any sooner. Just as I was about to reach that booth, do I hear a noise again, and I jump. It sounded like cans being stepped on or moved around. My head was hidden behind a pillar. As I composed myself, I moved over and peeked around the pillar. There was a pair of feet hanging outside the booth on the floor. I crept as quietly as possible to see who on earth is there. Was this one of my friends playing a prank on me? As I got closer, I saw the face of a disheveled-looking homeless man. He was asleep. He was twisting, and all around him were beer cans, monster cans, old food, packets of Snickers and stuff. My eyes opened wide as I realized that this guy was not supposed to be here, and quietly made my way out of there while running as fast as I could. When I reached the top, I called my manager, who I actually woke, and asked him if he knew that there was a homeless guy in the basement. He immediately sobered up from his sleep and told me to call the cops immediately. The cops arrived, but when they did, the man was gone. I think it was all the commotion. That's when we realized that at the back of the little booth, there is actually a secret hole that leads to one of the theatres towards the back, and then you can just go out one of the fire exits. It was incredibly weird and disturbing. My manager said he understood if I didn't want the task, but as I really needed the money, I told him to give me a week to get over it and that I'd do it anyway. It took a whole 3 weeks in order to complete the task, but the basement was looking good again, and we made sure to seal off this hidden basement door. We removed the booth, and everything was fine. I quit shortly after though, finding a better job in another town, one with a career, and tried to make something of myself. I am glad that these events happened, as it put me on the right path. But to the homeless man hiding out in the basement of the movie theater, let's never meet again. When I was 8 years old, my family moved to a new house. Both my parents worked pretty hard, and it was always just me and my sister, late into the evenings until my parents arrived, sufficiently drained and exhausted to give us the mandatory kiss on the cheek, dinner, and collapse on the couch. They were hard times. This house was a rental, but we liked it all the same. There was one part, however, that I did not enjoy, that being the basement. In truth, there wasn't a lot down there. Mostly just boxes with things that we didn't need or didn't need yet. Stuff that wouldn't look appropriate in our new house, as my mother said. We hardly ever went down there. There were few opportunities that required us to fetch things, except of course seasonal decorations and the like. I remember it must have been about July. We had been in the house for something like 8 months, and one day, as I'm passing the kitchen, I noticed that the basement door is ajar. Now, even though none of us ever go in here, this didn't strike me as odd at first, and I simply closed the door and went about my business. A few days later, the same thing. This time, it's ajar, but nearly closed, almost looking like someone had made a hasty retreat and forgotten to close the door properly. I approached the door with curiosity, still resigning it to the normal and thinking that there were nothing wrong with this situation. I just opened the door slightly, peered down the dark and foreboding steps, and then quietly closed the door with a creak. I closed it and went back to my room to do whatever I was doing. It was around this time that I also started to hear things. The TV room was located just above the basement stairs and door, with the kitchen on the other side, and the stairs sort of separating the two. As I was watching TV, it was an ad break, and I was listening intently. All of a sudden, I hear something. I turn the volume of the TV down and can make out the sound of footsteps, as slowly and as quietly as possible, trying to make their way up the stairs. I quietly make my own way to the stairs, throw open the door, and am greeted with nothing. But I did hear the panicked sounds of heavy breathing, and perhaps the last 3 footfalls of someone hitting the solid wooden stairs and getting to the bottom. I was quite confused. I called my mum and dad to check it out, asking them to see if there was a man in the basement. But when they returned from their trip down, they told me that there was nothing that they could find. Keep in mind, I never explicitly told them what was down there or what was wrong, so when they asked me what was wrong, I said I thought I heard something and didn't elaborate in the details. They told me that it was probably just a rodent and to not worry about it. I nodded my head, agreeing with them, and carried on with my day. But the noises persisted. Infrequent as they were, I would hear shuffling, things moving about, and my fear of the basement only grew. I began worrying that our basement was haunted, that there was some dark entity living underneath our house. In a moment of bravery, I confronted my sister and asked her if by any chance she had heard or experienced anything unusual in the basement or heard things from it. Without missing a beat, She fills me in that she has been hearing creepy stuff from the basement. And as her room is opposite the basement door, she tells me that there are times when she's going to sleep that she hears footsteps. Someone open the basement door quietly and make their way over to her room. She hears the door creak and then always hides under her blankets. I asked her why she never told Mum and Dad, and she said the one time she screamed for them, which I didn't know as I'm a very heavy sleeper, when they came in to investigate, there was no one there, so she didn't know if she was going mad or not. It was in this time that we, together, decided that we had to investigate. So when we got home from school that day, we grabbed a flashlight and a weapon from the kitchen. We descended the wooden stairs into the blackness, switched on the light switches, and turned on the flashlights for added protection. We scoped around the place, top to bottom, as best as a 12-year-old can do, I suppose, to check out what we could find. There wasn't much. We couldn't find any trace that the man was down here, leading us to believe there was a more paranormal element to our haunting. Just before we resigned ourselves to leave, did I notice something odd? Right by one of the boxes, there were a few things thrown about just outside, like someone had pushed it over and knocked the contents in a hurry. I walked over to look. It were the Christmas decorations. Weird, I thought. I put down a bauble and looked at my feet. And then, after moving the box slightly to the right, did I notice a trap door handle. Our basement was actually made of dirt, so the handle of a hatch was very out of place, very conveniently covered up so that no one would find it amongst all the clutter and a few bits that were left by the old house. We looked at each other, pushed one of the boxes aside, and considered looking down. My sister, being the bravest of the two, pulled the flap open quietly, as it was very creaky, and looked down into the abyss. That's when she saw a light at the very end, and a man talking to himself. He was being loud and rude, and my sister quietly and quickly closed the hatch as fast as she had opened it. She ran upstairs, called my mum and dad, and told them exactly what the situation was. She then called the police, who came extremely fast, even beating my parents, and went downstairs to arrest the guy. Turns out that underneath our basement, there are a few little tunnels that connects some of the shops and businesses around town. Naturally, these businesses had to seal their exits once they found them, and that was that. I don't know what happened to the man. Our parents refused to tell us, but I'm just glad he's gone from our lives, and we'll never have to see him again. I'm 16 and live with my mum in our 2-story house with a basement. Now, our basement isn't creepy or anything. It doesn't even really look like there is a basement. From the front door of the house, there's a little walkway, and then a set of carpeted stairs that leads to an open door frame that in turn leads into the basement. The basement has 3 rooms in it, and a bathroom. There is my room, which is at the beginning of the hallway, and the spare room, which is right across from my room. Now, the hallway that separates our room is only maybe 100 to 200 feet long, if that, and is covered by that fake tile stuff that you can buy at hardware stores. If you walk down the hallway, you'll first come across an opening off to your right side that houses the water heater and the entry to the crawl space. It has a clothesline that goes across it to hang up any clothes that couldn't dry in the dryer. Continue walking and maybe 20 feet later, you'll come across the bathroom, which will be on your left. At the very end of the hallway, it opens up into a bigger squared room that we call the playroom. Now that you've got the layout of the basement, onto the story. I've always felt as if there was something off about the house. I'd feel my eyes on me in my room, shadows moving in the corner of my vision, maybe hands brushing my back as I walk up my mum's room onto the uppermost floor to say good morning to her. I'd almost always brush it off, because these little things never seemed malicious to me. There have been 2 times, however, where I would feel something look at me that was more malicious. One time was last year, before we remodeled my room. We had just brought the paint, and I was getting ready to go to sleep. I turned off all the lights and climbed into bed, shutting my eyes. Something, however, compelled me to open them that night, and when I did, I saw a figure standing in the upper left-hand corner of my room glaring at me. That was the first time I felt utterly rooted to my bed by the terror that I felt and the hatred and anger oozing off whatever was by the corner of my room. But then I blinked, and suddenly there was no figure, just my old broom leaning against the corner. The maliciousness was gone, and I could feel I could breathe again. The second time was just tonight, about half-hour ago. I was getting water to fill up my fish tank a little, because the level had dropped. I had a pitcher that I was using to fill water up, and I had just filled it up in the bathroom down here, when I turned around and there it was again. The figure, standing only about 15 feet away from the entry of the bathroom, under part of the clothesline that spanned the area where the crawl space was. The anger and hatred I felt from that thing, the thing that was almost suffocating. I almost dropped the pitcher of water I was holding. I would have, if I wasn't paralyzed with fear. Within a few seconds I found my voice, and my brain managed to regain control. I screamed and stepped back. As soon as I did, the figure vanished once more. It took all I could to not run back to my room and close the door as quickly as I could. The thing was, this time I was shaking. I barely managed to dump the water into my fish tank without spilling it. I don't want to leave my room again tonight. I don't know if I'm just imagining these things, or if there is truly something in the basement that doesn't want me here. I'd like to begin by saying that there have been many happenings in this house, but I will share the most frightening. The area where my house is was once open prairie, and we have found Native American artifacts laying around the area. When my parents divorced when I was a young teenager, my mother and I moved into this house. Now at first it seemed great. There was plenty of space, and it had a very cozy feel to it. However, as time went on, strange things began to happen. The more I noticed them, the more frequent they would become. I'd hear some walking downstairs as I was brushing my teeth, and would assume it was my mother, but whenever I'd check, no one would be there. Footsteps began to be a very common sound in my house, especially at night. So after some time I came to the realization that, oh crap, my house is haunted. Now here's where things get really weird. One day my good friend and I had just gotten done from being out in the sun and decided to retreat to my mum's house. Considering she had been away on business, we figured this would be awesome. My friend and I could go drink or do whatever mischievous activities we wanted to. We were wrong. We walked inside and headed straight for the basement, where it was cooler than the rest of the house. While walking down the stairs, I noticed that the Beatles' Yellow Submarine poster that was hanging on the bottom of the stairwell was tilted slightly to the left. No bother, I figured. It must have gotten bumped by me or something. I fixed it, and we walked into the main room. Mind you, we had pictures and posters hanging everywhere in the basement. What my friend and I saw creeped us out. All 10 to 15 pictures on these walls were each tilted slightly to the left, just as the Beatles once had been. But the weirdness of the situation didn't stop there. The storage room, which was essentially a dirt-floored room that was lifted about 4 feet off the ground, had its door cracked open. So I walked over to see a golden glow emanating out of it. There's a pull cord light located about 10 feet from the door that's turned on. I hop up and into the storage room, crawl on my hands and knees to turn the light off, hoping that all of this had a natural explanation. I called my mum and asked her about it, and she said she has no idea what I'm talking about and hasn't been to the basement for weeks, and to leave her on her trip. Shivers shoot down my spine. I look back into the storage room, and in the dirt there's a footprint. The most distorted and mangled footprint imaginable. I'm frozen in fear. My friend is too. Without the words, we look at one another, each feeling a sickening, gut-wrenching feeling. I slammed the storage space shut, locked it, and we bolted out of my house as fast as we could. I'll never forget how sickening and mangled that footprint was, and thinking that I had crawled in there to turn the light off still gives me shivers to this day. Almost every night, I like to go into my basement for a night of playing video games with my friends. Normally the night goes well and I'm in bed by 1, but recently I have been hearing sounds in my basement, such as what I believe to be coughing and sometimes snoring. When I hear this, I immediately go up to my room and sleep until the morning. When I go back down to my computer, I am sometimes greeted with odd websites that I have never visited, and my initial thought was that I had a virus. I did a virus scan and found nothing. When this happened again 3 times over the course of 2 weeks, I completely wiped my hard drive of everything, and when I woke up in the morning, Google Chrome had been installed to my computer, and 30 tabs were open to various websites. But the strangest one was the FedEx website, telling me my package had been shipped. I didn't look where, but I regret it now. Almost 3 months had gone by, and I hadn't thought much about the situation other than the odd sounds, and I asked my friend to go into the basement to get something for me. I was surprised when he ran up the stairs as fast as he could, and what he said he saw next was enough to prompt me to call the police. He said he saw someone crawling out of the window well by the time he got down there, and all he saw was that person's legs. We ran outside to look for them, but there were no signs of them anywhere. We both assumed that they had gone into the woods about 50 feet from my house. When the police came, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The police left and my friend left 15 minutes later, understandably frightened by what he had just seen. For the next 2 months, I still heard these sounds and experienced scary and strange occurrences, like my downstairs shower being wet when nobody had used it beforehand. And one day, they all stopped, and I had a note on my desk written in Sharpie that said thanks for the stay. And that was the end of the situation. For the longest time, I thought the note was part of an elaborate prank. But now, I'm not so sure. With all the other stuff that's happened between all of that, and the fact that my family had all been asleep during these encounters to this day, I still have no idea who that person is, and don't really care to find out. When I was about 4 years old, my parents and I moved into a new house in a really awesome neighborhood. Everything was going great. One night, my dad woke up to heavy knocking on our front door at 3 a.m. He went to see what was going on, and there were multiple police cars and a bunch of policemen standing around our house. My dad opened the door and asked the officers what was wrong. One of them said, "Sir, I need you to bring your wife and child if you have one downstairs. Then I need you to step outside with these officers here." My dad had no idea what in the world was happening, but he went upstairs and woke up my mum and I. When he brought us down, the officers sat my mum and me on the couch and started asking some super weird questions. Does your husband ever hurt you? Has he ever made you feel helpless? Have you ever gone into your basement to get away from him? Does he ever lay hands on you or your child? All stuff like that. My mum was shocked and of course said no to all of it. My dad would never do something like that. The policemen with flashlights and guns came in and asked to search our house. We said yes because we were honestly freaked out at this point and no one was telling us what was going on. They walked around our house and then asked to see our basement. Our basement is not finished, but it is quite large and super creepy. I hate it so much. No one ever goes down there and we keep it locked. My dad unlocked it and they searched it and were calling out stuff like, "We're here to help, please come out." They couldn't find anything of interest and came back upstairs. Then my dad told them that we deserved to know what was going on. One of them said, "Nothing seems to be the matter here, so I guess it's fine to tell you. We received a call from a woman who was in hysterics. She was screaming and crying, saying that her husband was going to finish her. She had barricaded herself in her basement to get away from him." My dad was spooked and said, "Well, why would you come to our house?" The officer said, "We traced the call to your house. And that is why I hate my basement so much more than I already did. Our neighborhood is very old and so is our house. So maybe it's a ghost or something. We still don't know what happened that night, but I do know that sometimes weird stuff happens in my basement. It has a door to the outside that we keep locked, but I've even been outside and seen it swing open. We even use stuff like deadbolts, so that's fun for us, I guess." My sister had a sleepover with her friend this weekend. They were both down in the basement because the rec room was there. It's a pretty cozy room with an old Xbox, an easel for painting, some armchairs and comics. My sister and her friend often play around there by themselves, painting, playing Minecraft, usual 13-year-old stuff. We're used to them being alone down there, and our basement isn't seen as creepy or unsettling in any way. On Friday night, however, our evening got interrupted by the girls scrambling up the stairs, shrieking like a couple of bats out of hell. "There's something in the basement," my sister screamed. We figured they'd gotten spooked by a spider or something like that, so my parents went down to investigate. The basement was found empty. The girls were asked what all the fuss was about, and they told my parents the door handle to the basement began rattling so hard the entire door started shaking. I later asked my sister what all the yelling was about, and she showed me what had happened. It was like someone was trying to rip the door off, she told me, while grabbing the door handle and yanking it like someone trapped. It couldn't have been a draft, as the bathroom isn't connected to any of the outside walls, nor does it have any windows. They were laughing and giggling like crazy from the excitement of getting spooked like that, and we left it at being a weird but harmless occurrence. It did, however, remind me of something that I remember happening to me when I was a kid in that same basement. I must have been 8 years old, because I had gotten my own keys and was allowed to walk home on my own. I knew my parents were at work, so I unlocked the door and stepped inside. As I did, I looked at the basement door, and as I stepped in, I saw the door handle start to rattle and the door opening. I got so scared I bolted out of the house straight over to my friend's house, bawling my eyes out the entire way. Once my parents came home and I told them what happened, they explained what a cross draft was and how that's the most likely explanation for what caused the door to open. I believed it back then, but after this weekend, I'm not so certain. When I was 18, I was attending university and renting a room in an old house a few blocks off campus. Only one other room in the house was rented, and the girl who lived there spent most of her time at her boyfriend's place. I basically had the entire house to myself. I would estimate that it was built sometime between 1910 and 20, based on the style and neighborhood, but I could be wrong. I do know that it was about 100 years old at the time, and the oldest home I'd ever had. It was my first time living alone, and since it was such a big empty space, I spent most of my time in my room behind a locked door. It wasn't super creepy or anything, but at night when I was alone, I tended to avoid leaving my room unless absolutely necessary. It had the same uneasy feeling of turning off the basement light and then running up the stairs as fast as you could in the dark. Not for any real reason, but it made your heart race anyway. Near the end of my first semester, I contracted influenza A. I'd been pretty fortunate with my physical health up until then, and it was the sickest I'd ever been in my life. I could barely peel myself out of bed to go to the bathroom or to feed myself. I was incredibly weak, my whole body ached, and I was running a very high fever. I actually developed arthritis in my joints as a symptom, which I didn't even know was possible. I remember waking up with a puddle of sweat collected in the hollow of my throat at one point. It was absolutely disgusting. A few days into the ordeal, I woke up to find an elderly man sitting by the side of my bed. There was no chair there, but he was very obviously in a seated position. For some reason, I didn't react with shock at all. I was completely unafraid. I asked him what he was doing there, and he simply said, "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." I must have fallen back asleep because that's all I remember from the visit. This could have easily been a NyQuil-induced dream or a fevered hallucination, but to me it was absolutely real. He was there, he spoke to me, and I felt very comforted by his presence. A few months later, I had a friend of mine from another school come visit for the weekend. We did some exploring of the house and found a hatch to the basement. It was filled with old tools and hardware. But one thing that stood out to me for no apparent reason, on the wall was a medicine cabinet absolutely stuffed with old pill bottles, regular things like Anacin and other old brand names that I had to look up. It also contained many prescription pill bottles that were too faded to read. For some reason, as soon as I saw them, my elderly visitor came to mind. I wondered if maybe he had some experience caring for a sick relative, and came to visit me when I was ill because it was a familiar situation. I did ask the landlord about previous occupants, but they had purchased the house only a few years earlier, and didn't know much. I suppose I'll never know. I'm pretty sure that my basement is bigger than the house itself. With that, there is a good amount of stuff down there. The stairs are in the middle of the basement and leads to the left side of the basement. On the right side, opposite the staircase, is where the washer and dryers are. This is where my story takes place. Every time myself or my dad's girlfriend goes down there to do laundry, we get this very, very strong feeling of being watched. It's not so malicious, but it's freaky. I have a look over my shoulder every 10 seconds because I'm so sure someone is looking at me, but every time I look around, there's no one. Most times I have to bring my dog down with me so that I have some comfort. Even my female dog gets shaken up about being down there. I should note that I used to sleep in the basement of about 3 or 4 months, and I never got that feeling. I feel a bit of hate and resentment when I'm down there, but it's not strong like the feeling of being watched. It really was starting to freak me out, to the point where I can't even step foot on the concrete floor anymore. I started doing my laundry and then closed the top of the machine, and as it started I was walking away. I then heard this high-pitched scream in my ear like a little girl, like something pretended to be one. I froze for 10 seconds and bolted up the stairs, and just was at the top of the stairs ready to close the door when I heard another high-pitched scream at the bottom, and it was ascending. I have no clue what to think anymore. I'm just really scared. I've even brought my dog down with me if I have to go down there. I just can't stand it. Some stuff happened to me, but most of this happened to my brother. Really, the most that happened to me was that if I left the basement, like watching television to grab a snack, I would return and certain things would be out of place. For example, television remotes, dishes that would be left down there. Sometimes the remotes were 10 feet away from where they should be. And every time I'd go to my family to see if they had tampered with anything, the answer would always be no. Sometimes I would hear my name being called out, but dismissed that easily, because I could have been hearing things. I didn't worry about this all too much, because there were no worries behind it. I was always just dismissing it. Now here is where all the freaky stuff begins. My brother always told me stories of him hearing things, like his voice being called by my parents at 3 a.m. The two biggest events that happened to him were one when he was sitting playing video games in his room in the basement, and there's a sort of hallway/pool room that is before you enter his. While he was enjoying himself, on his right shoulder, he got really cold, and he made efforts to warm it back up, but it wasn't working. And when he swiveled his chair to the right and looked into the mirror, there he was facing the door, and he saw a shadow dart in or out of his room. And then on another time, he was hearing things outside of his room. So he gets up, goes to the bathroom, comes out, and he's growling behind our pool table. We do not have dogs. He craps himself and runs into his room and locks it. Shortly after he locks it, his door handle jiggles for about 30 seconds and then stops. Weirdly though, I am not that afraid of my basement, but at night, I do not enjoy being down there alone. When I was very young, I lived in a house which was very old. I think it must have been at least 70 years old. I loved that house so much except for the basement. I always hated the malevolent vibe that was ever present in the air down there. It felt evil, and I don't mean that lightly. I always felt like a pair of cold eyes were watching my every move, waiting to strike. I got the worst vibe from the room at the end of the hallway. Yes, a hallway in a basement. There was a small room at the end of the hall. The air there was thick with dread. It felt like something would lunge out at me at any moment. The only time I voluntarily went into the room was when there was a tornado warning. While in that room, I vividly remember feeling an awful force from the top right corner. I never dared to look away from the corner, even to find comfort by leaning into my mum for fear of whatever was lurking down there. I only recently found out from an old neighbor who had lived in the house beside us for a very long time that the last owner hung himself in that very corner of the basement. I was shocked when I heard that. Very little else was mentioned about him. One other previous owner also did the same thing in my old closet. I remember that it used to freak me out being in there, But thinking back on it now, I never felt the same feeling of dread that I did then while I was in the basement. So maybe they didn't want to hurt us. I don't think the same can be said for the other one though. It has been at least 10 years since I was last in that house, and even if I were to go back, I would not set foot in the basement. My dad's job requires him to go inside people's houses. He has been in thousands of apartments and homes, so I asked him what was the weirdest and creepiest thing he has ever seen or experienced. My dad arrived early to this apartment complex around 7 a.m. because he had to go through every apartment doing some maintenance starting from the basement. He entered a laundry room located in the basement, where a man was in his 50s, wearing a nice white shirt and tie, suit pants but no shoes, and he had a green tarp in his hands. He thought it was kind of weird, but just ignored it since it's not his business. Later that day, he left to a local coffee shop to spend his break, and when he came back to work, there were police cars surrounding the area. Out of curiosity, he asked one of the police officers what was going on, and it turns out a homicide was committed. Dad then asked if what he saw was related to the crime, and it was. After the police interrogation, they told him that the man without shoes stabbed his mother to death in the bathtub, wrapped her in a tarp, and dragged her outside. The police caught her dragging his dead mother in the backyard. Of course, they didn't let my dad do his job in the murderer's apartment until after a proper investigation. A while goes by, and Dad gets to go there and finish what he's doing. He felt really uncomfortable doing plumbing and other maintenance in a house where someone had just been brutally finished off, especially in a bathroom, in a bathtub full of dried up blood. When I was a dumb kid, my brother and I were playing around on the stairs. I was at the top jumping around in a pillowcase. I slipped, obviously, and went tumbling down backwards. Everything went into slow motion, as things sometimes do when your life is in peril. As I was flipping over and over, the back of my skull getting closer by the second to smashing into the hard concrete basement floor, I notice a movement coming from the dark basement. Suddenly, a large bag of dog food flies across the room as if hurled by an invisible hand with absurd precision, and interposed itself between my head and the floor. My skull smashes into the bag a millisecond later, spraying kibble instead of skull fragments around the room. My brother and I were both slack-jawed and confused. The flying bag had traveled at least 10 feet, likely saving me from death or serious injury. I used to think this was evidence for God or angels, or that I have some kind of purpose, but I realize this is evidence for nothing in particular, except that life is bizarre and unexpected things can and do happen. I had my Nintendo Wii down in the basement for the longest time, and would spend hours down there. I was playing one night, and all of a sudden the TV and Wii turned off. I went to check the plug because it was loose sometimes, and can theoretically fall out if pulled. I wasn't pulling it to turn it off though, as I was gaming and not near the cords. I looked up from the cords as I was fixing it and saw a light grey mist in the air. I looked at it for a few seconds and then ran upstairs like the floor was on fire, and didn't go there for a while again. I have thought over it now that I'm older, and can't really see how a mist could just appear there. No leaking pipes to create moisture, no one in the house that smokes anything. The only person who smoked in my family was my grandfather, who had been deceased for a while at that point. I did have his pilot's vest hanging nearby at the time though. The one and only paranormal thing that has ever happened to me was when I was around 14 years old, sitting on my couch in my basement alone watching TV. With no warning, I start hearing this slow humming noise directly to my left, inches away, and every hair on my left side stands on end. I don't know how, but I had the balls to stand up, walk, and turn off the TV without a remote, and walk up the stairs. All the while I'm about to OD on adrenaline. Nothing but a noise and a feeling, but I vividly remember repeating in my head, something is right next to me. I never had another incident after that one.